The sun clawed at the earth, relentless, turning the ground to brittle shards beneath his boots. Dust hung in the air like a shroud, coating his throat with every breath. Caleb trudged through the scorched valley, his shadow stretching long and thin, a ghost trailing behind. His lips cracked, bled, and cracked again. The canteen at his hips sloshed faintly, almost empty now, just enough to taunt him. 3 days since the wagon left him, the driver's eyes cold as slate. No words offered, no backward glance, just the creak of wheels fading into the horizon, abandoning him to this endless, bone-dry nowhere. His knees wavered, not from hunger, but from something heavier, grief maybe, or the weight of being forgotten. The Colt at his side felt like a useless relic, its grip worn smooth from years of clinging to it for answers it couldn't give. He'd buried his brother under a mesquite tree 2 summers back, the only family he'd ever known, and the world hadn't stopped to notice. Now it seemed the world had shed him too. The wind hissed, stirring the sagebrush, and carried the faint hum of voices somewhere ahead. Caleb squinted, his eyes stinging from dust and sun. A town maybe, or a mirage. He'd seen both before. The auction block stood in the center of the settlement, a splintered wooden platform baking under the noon glare. Men in sweat-stained hats crowded around, their murmurs blending with the clink of coins and the occasional shout of a bid. Caleb leaned against a warped fence post, his body aching, trying to blend into the shadow of his own hat. He didn't belong here, not with these men bartering over cattle and land like they were trading pieces of their souls. His hand rested on the canteen, fingers trembling, debating whether to drink the last of it or save it for when death came closer. A boy's voice cut through the noise, small but sharp like a blade through cloth. "Please, mister, help us." Caleb's gaze lifted, slow, reluctant. The boy stood at the edge of the platform, no older than 10, his face streaked with dirt and desperation. His clothes hung loose, patched and fraying, and his eyes wide gray, unblinking, locked onto Caleb's. Behind him, a girl, maybe 12, clutched his hand. Her hair was matted, her dress torn at the shoulder, and her stare held something older than her years, something that made Caleb's chest tighten. She didn't speak, but her presence was a weight, a silent plea that pinned him where he stood. That everything froze. The auctioneer's drone faded, the crowd's mutter dulled to a hum. The boy's words hung in the air, fragile as glass, and Caleb, but certainly as an actor and stirring something he'd tried to bury. He wanted to look away, to keep walking, to let the desert take him like it had taken everything else. But the girl's eyes held him dark, steady, like they saw through the dust and the scars to the man he'd been before the world broke him. He stepped closer, boots scuffing the dirt, and the boy flinched but didn't back away. "What's your trouble, kid?" Caleb's voice rasped, unused for days, rough as the land around them. The boy swallowed, glancing at the girl, then back to Caleb. "They're selling us," he said, barely a whisper. "Me and Leela pa's gone, and they say we ain't got no one. They're gonna split us up." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked past the boy to the auctioneer, a wiry man with a ledger and a smirk, calling out lots like he was selling hogs. The crowd didn't care, didn't see the boy's trembling hands or the girl's rigid silence. Caleb's fingers brushed. That Colt, an old habit, but he let his hand fall. Violence wouldn't fix this. Not yet. The girl, Lila, stepped forward, still gripping her brother's hand. Her voice was low, steady, like she'd practiced the words. "You look like someone who knows what it's like to be left behind." Her words hit like a stone, and Caleb's breath caught. He saw then the same hollowness he carried reflected in her gaze. The desert had taken from her too, stripped her bare. But she stood there, unyielding, daring him to care. He didn't answer. Not yet. The sun pressed harder, the dust swirled thicker, and the auctioneer's voice rose again, calling their names like they were nothing more than numbers in his book. Asterisk, asterisk. The air thickened with heat, the kind that pressed against the skin, like a warning. Caleb's eyes stayed on Lila, her words still echoing in his skull left behind. He knew that wound, the way it festered, raw and unhealing. The boy, who hadn't given his name, tugged at Lila's sleeve, his small frame trembling under the weight of the crowd's indifference. Caleb's hand hovered near his belt, not for the Colt but for the canteen. Its meager slosh, a reminder of his own fragility. He didn't owe them anything. He could walk away, let the desert swallow them all. But the memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. His brother Jonah, lying under that mesquite tree, skin gray, breath gone. Caleb had clawed at the dirt until his nails bled, begging the earth to give him back. No one had come then, no stranger, no savior, just the wind, mocking him with its empty howl. He blinked, and the boy's gray eyes blurred into Jonah's, pleading, trusting. Caleb's throat tightened, and he looked away, toward the horizon where the sky bled red. The auctioneer's voice snapped him back. Lot 12. 2 orphans, strong for their age. Boys good for labor, girl for housework. Start at $10. The crowd stirred, a low chuckle rippling through. Caleb's stomach churned. He saw Lila's hand tighten around her brother's, her knuckles white, her face a mask of defiance. The boy's lip quivered, but he stood straighter, mimicking her strength. They were alone, like he'd been, but they hadn't broken yet. Caleb stepped forward, closer to the platform, his boots kicking up dust that clung to his worn trousers. The auctioneer noticed him, eyes narrowing. "You bidding, stranger?" he called, voice slick with greed. Caleb didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the crowdmen with hard faces, hands stuffed in pockets or gripping whiskey bottles. None of them saw the children, not really. Just tools, just flesh to be bought. His fingers twitched, itching for the Colt again, but he forced them still. He remembered the nights after Jonah's death, the endless miles he'd walked, chasing nothing. The stars had been his only company, cold and distant, offering no mercy. He'd sat by campfires, whispering to ghosts, promising he'd never care again. Caring hurt too much. But Lila's words clawed at him, and the boy's desperate stare was a mirror he couldn't escape. He'd been left behind, yes, but he'd kept walking. These kids, they might not. 15, a voice shouted from the crowd. A burly man, with a tobacco-stained beard, raised his hand. Smirking, Caleb's jaw clenched. He didn't have $15, not even close. The few coins in his pocket were barely enough for a meal, if he could find one, but the thought of that man's hands on the boy, on Lila, made his blood burn. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the platform. 20, Caleb said, his voice low, steady, surprising even himself. The crowd hushed, heads turning. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "You got 20, drifter. Show it." Caleb's hand went to his pocket, fingers brushing the coins, knowing they wouldn't add up. His eyes met Lila's, and she didn't look away. Her stare was a challenge, a dare to be more than the broken thing he'd become. Thought of Jonah again, the way he'd laughed, head thrown back, under a sky full of stars. They'd been boys once, running through fields, dreaming of a life bigger than the one they'd been given. That dream had died with Jonah, buried under that tree. But these kids, they were still here, still fighting. Caleb's chest ached, a deep, unfamiliar pull. He didn't have the money, but he had something else, maybe enough to make a difference. "I'll work it off," Caleb said, louder now, stepping onto the platform. The crowd muttered, skeptical. The auctioneer laughed. A sharp, barking sound. "Work? You look half dead, mister. What's your trade?" Caleb didn't flinch. "Whatever you need. I've herded cattle, broken horses, built fences. I don't quit." His voice carried a weight he hadn't heard in years. A spark of the man he'd been before the desert claimed him. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at the crowd, then at the children. Lila's eyes hadn't left Caleb's, and the boy's hand was still in hers, small but fierce. The wind kicked up, carrying dust across the platform, and for a moment, it was just the three of them, strangers, bound by something unspoken, something stronger than the sun's cruel heat. Asterisk, asterisk, the platform creaked under Caleb's weight, the wood groaning like it resented his presence. The crowd's murmurs grew sharper, a hive of whispers buzzing with doubt. He stood there, shoulders squared, his shadow long and jagged across the splintered boards. Lila and the boy, whose name he still didn't know, watched him, their eyes twin beacons in the haze of dust and heat. The auctioneer's smirk faltered, his ledger clutched like a shield. "Work, you say," he drawled, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't no one here trusts a drifter's word. Show coin or step off." Caleb's fingers curled, the few coins in his pocket heavy as guilt. He could feel the crowd's eyes, their judgment like the sun's relentless burn. He thought of walking away, letting the desert take its due, but Lila's gaze held him, steady, unyielding, like she saw something he'd forgotten, a man who could still choose to fight. The boy's hand trembled in hers, but he didn't cry, not yet. Caleb remembered Jonah's laugh again, the way it had filled the silence of their boyhood nights, before the world taught them loss. He couldn't let these kids become another ghost. "I'll vouch for him." A voice rough as gravel cut through the crowd. Heads turned, and Caleb followed their gaze to a woman at the edge of the throng. She was older, her face carved by years and sun, her gray hair pulled tight under a faded bonnet, her hands calloused and knotted, gripped a walking stick planted firm in the dirt. "Caleb Reed, ain't it?" she said, stepping forward, her eyes sharp despite the lines around them. "Knew your brother Jonah was a good man. If you're half what he was, your word's enough." The name hit Caleb like a fist. He hadn't heard it spoken by another in years, and it stirred the ache he'd buried. He didn't know her, didn't recognize the face, but the way she said Jonah's name soft, certain, made him believe her. The crowd shifted, uneasy, their skepticism wavering. The auctioneer's eyes darted between Caleb and the woman. "Calculating you're vouching for a stranger, Martha?" he asked, voice tight. She nodded, her stick tapping the ground. "I am heel work. Let him take the kids." Caleb's chest tightened, not with relief, but with something heavier, obligation maybe, or the weight of being seen. He glanced at Lila, who hadn't moved, her face still a mask, but her eyes softened, just a fraction. The boy's shoulders slumped, like he'd been holding his breath too long. The auctioneer grunted, scribbling in his ledger. "Fine, $20 worth of work. You default. They're back on the block." He waved a hand, dismissing them, already calling the next lot. Martha led them away, her stick tapping a steady rhythm. Caleb followed, Lila and the boy trailing close, their steps hesitant but sure. The town's edges blurred into scrubland, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of fire. Martha's cabin was a mile out, a squat structure of weathered wood and adobe, crouched against a low hill. Inside, it smelled of sage and old leather, the air cool against Caleb's sunburned skin. She pointed to a corner with a straw pallet. "They sleep there," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You out back, there's a lead to work. It starts at dawn." Caleb nodded, his throat too dry for words. Lila and the boy sat on the pallet, close together, their hands still linked. The boy whispered something, and Lila shook her head, her eyes flicking to Caleb. He felt their weight, their trust, fragile as glass. He stepped outside, the night air sharp, the stars beginning to prick the sky. He thought of Jonah again, the nights they'd slept under that same sky, dreaming of a home they'd never find. He'd failed Jonah, let him slip away. These kids, he couldn't fail them too. The lean-to was barely a shelter, just slanted boards and a dirt floor, but it was enough. He sat his back against the rough wood and unstoppered the canteen. The last drops hit his tongue, warm and metallic, and he closed his eyes. The desert was quiet now, the wind a low murmur carrying the faint scent of creosote. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, work debt or another kind of loss, but for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Asterisk, dawn broke over the hill, a thin line of gold slicing through the gray. Caleb woke with a light, his body stiff from the cold dirt floor of the lintel. The air smelled of dew and dust, the desert waking slow and reluctant. He stood his joints protesting, and rubbed his hands together, the calluses rough against his palms. Martha was already up, her silhouette moving in the cabin's faint glow, the clink of a kettle punctuating the silence. Lila and the boy were inside, their shadows small against the wall, huddled close like they expected the world to pull them apart again. Caleb's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the cabin. Martha met him at the door, her eyes scanning him like she was measuring his worth. "Fence needs mending," she said, handing him a tin mug of coffee, its heat searing his cracked fingers. "Start there. Tools in the shed." She didn't wait for a reply, turning back to the stove, her stick tapping the floor. Caleb sipped the coffee, bitter and thin, and felt it settle heavy in his empty stomach. He glanced at the kids. Lila was braiding her brother's hair, her fingers quick and gentle, her face unreadable. The boy, still nameless to Caleb, watched him, eyes wide, like he was waiting for a promise. The fence was a half-mile out, a sagging line of posts and wire chewed by time and wind. Caleb worked alone, the sun climbing, its heat creeping up. His neck he drove posts into the hard earth, each swing of the maul jarring his bones, stirring memories he didn't want. Jonah's voice, low and teasing, echoed in his head. "You swing like you're mad at the ground." Cal, they'd built fences together once, back when they thought they could outrun their past. Caleb's grip tightened and he swung harder, the post sinking deep, the pain in his shoulders a distraction from the ache in his chest. By noon, his hands were blistered, his shirt soaked through. He paused, wiping his brow, and saw Lila approaching, a bucket in her hands. She set it down without a word. Water, a chunk of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Her eyes flicked to his hands, the blood seeping through the dirt. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice low, like she was testing him. "You could leave. People do." Caleb met her gaze, saw the guarded hope there, the fear of being abandoned again. He thought of Jonah's grave, the dirt he'd never washed from his hands. "I ain't people," he said, and took the bread. She lingered, watching him eat, her silence louder than words. The boy appeared then, running from the cabin, his small feet kicking up dust. "I'm Ethan," he blurted like he'd been holding it in too long. Caleb nodded, the name settling into him like a stone. Ethan, Lila's brother. He saw Jonah in the boy's eager eyes, the way he stood close to his sister, trusting her to hold the world at bay. Caleb's throat tightened, and he looked away, toward the fence stretching into the distance. The days blurred, each one a rhythm of work and quiet. Caleb mended fences, hauled water, chopped wood, his body growing stronger even as his heart wrestled with itself. Martha watched, her approval silent but clear in the extra cornbread she left out, the way she let Ethan trail Caleb like a shadow. Lila kept her distance, her eyes always searching, like she was waiting for him to break his word. At night, Caleb lay in the lean-to, the stars sharp above, and thought of Jonah, of the promises he'd failed to keep. He didn't know if he could be what these kids needed, but he wanted to try. One evening, as the sky burned purple, Lila sat beside him outside the cabin, her knees drawn up. Ethan slept inside, his soft snores drifting through the open door. "Pa used to say the stars were stories," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the wind. "Said they'd guide us if we listened." Caleb followed her gaze, the constellations bright against the dark. He thought of Jonah's laughter, the way it had lit up the night. "What's your story, then?" he asked, surprising himself. Lila didn't answer right away, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "Same as yours," she said finally, "trying to find a place that don't hurt." The words hung between them, heavy and true. Caleb felt the weight of her trust, fragile as the starlight, and knew he stood at a crossroads not just for them, but for himself. Asterisk, asterisk, the desert held its breath, the night air sharp with the scent of creosote and cooling earth. Caleb sat outside the liento, his back against the rough boards, the stars above a map of stories he couldn't read. Leela's words lingered a place that don't hurt, and they cut deeper than he expected, stirring the old wound of Yona's absence. He'd spent years running from that pain, letting the desert grind him down to bone and dust. But now, with Leela and Ethan asleep in the cabin, their trust a fragile weight on his shoulders, he felt the pull of something new. Not hope, not yet, but a choice to stay or to keep running. Morning came harsh, the sun clawing over the hill, painting the scrubland in stark light and shadow. Martha had work waiting, hauling water from a spring a mile off, the buckets heavy, enough to make Caleb's arms burn. Ethan trailed him, carrying a smaller pail, his chatter a steady hum against the silence. "You ever seen a river, Mr. the boy asked, his voice bright despite the dust on his face. Caleb grunted, adjusting the yoke across his shoulders. "Seen a few, ain't much to 'em." Ethan's eyes widened, like rivers were miracles. "Leela says we'll see one someday," says PA promised. Caleb didn't answer, but the boy's words tugged at him, a reminder of promises he'd made and broken. Leela stayed behind, helping Martha with the washing, her hands quick in the soapy water. Caleb caught glimpses of her through the cabin window, her face set, her movements deliberate. She didn't speak much, but her silence was loud, watching him, weighing him. He felt it every time he passed by, her eyes asking if he'd stay or if he'd be another shadow fading into the horizon. He wanted to tell her he wasn't going anywhere, but the words stuck, heavy as the buckets he carried. The work stretched into weeks, each day a battle against the land and himself. Caleb's hands hardened, his blisters turning to cut, his body remembering what it was to be useful. Martha's land began to take shape, fences stood straighter, the garden patch grew less wild. Ethan followed him everywhere, asking questions, mimicking his movements, his small hands trying to match Caleb's strength. Leela kept her distance, but she was there bringing water, mending his torn shirt, her gestures small but steady, like she was testing the ground between them. Asterisk. One afternoon, as Caleb hammered a new post into the earth, a rider came, dust trailing behind him like a storm. The man was lean, his face shadowed by a wide hat, his eyes cold as the auctioneer's. Martha met him at the cabin, her stick planted firm, her voice low but sharp. Caleb watched from the fence line, Ethan at his side, the boy's chatter gone quiet. "Who's that?" Ethan whispered, clutching Caleb's sleeve. Caleb didn't know, but the man's presence felt like a threat, a crack in the fragile peace they'd built. Martha called Caleb over, her face unreadable. "He's from town," she said, nodding at the rider. "Says the debt ain't paid, wants the kids back." Caleb's blood went cold, his hand brushing the colt out of habit. The rider's eyes flicked to the movement, a smirk curling his lip. "You, the drifter?" he asked, voice smooth as oil. "Work's one thing, but coin's what counts. You got 30 days, or they're on the block again." He tipped his hat, mocking, and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and dread. Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes on the horizon where the rider vanished. Ethan's hand was still on his sleeve, trembling now, and Lila stood in the doorway, her face pale but fierce. "You gonna let him take us?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Caleb met her gaze, saw Jonah there, saw himself. He'd run from everything, grief, guilt, the world, but he couldn't run from this. "No," he said, the word solid, final. "I ain't." That night, he didn't sleep. The stars burned, bright, their stories silent, and Caleb felt the crossroads sharp and clear. He could fight for them, risk everything, his freedom, his life, where he could walk away, let the desert take its due. Lila's words echoed again, a place that don't hurt. Aunt. He knew there was no such thing, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something close. Asterisk, asterisk, the days tightened like a noose, each one counting down to the rider's deadline. Caleb worked harder, his hands raw from mending fences, hauling stones, repairing Martha's sagging barn. The desert didn't care, its sun scorching the earth, its nights cold and unyielding. Ethan stayed close, his small hands trying to help, his questions quieter now, as if he sensed the shadow creeping closer. Lila watched from a distance, her eyes sharp, her silence a wall Caleb couldn't breach. He felt her doubt, her fear that he'd break, and it gnawed at him, sharper than the ache in his bones. At night, he lay in the lean-to, the stars mocking him with their indifference. He thought of Jonah, the way he'd promised to keep them together, a vow broken by fever and a cruel spring. Caleb had carried that failure like a stone in his chest, and now it pressed heavier, mingled with the weight of Leela and Ethan. Trust. He didn't have $30, didn't know if he could earn it in time. Martha's land was better for his work, but her purse was as lean as his. The rider's smirk haunted him, a reminder that the world took what it wanted, leaving only dust behind. One morning, as Caleb sharpened an axe by the cabin, Leela approached, her steps deliberate. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, her fingers tied around it. "This was PA's," she said, unwrapping a silver pocket watch, its face scratched but gleaming. "It's all we got left. Sell it." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her grief, raw and unguarded. Caleb took the watch, its weight cold in his palm. He saw Jonah's knife in his mind, the one he'd traded for a horse after the grave was dug. He'd hated himself for it, for letting go of the last piece of his brother. "You sure?" he asked, his voice rough. Lila nodded, her jaw tight. "It ain't PA, it's just a thing." He rode to town that afternoon, the watch heavy in his pocket, the horse borrowed from Martha's neighbor. The streets were quiet, dust swirling in lazy spirals, the air thick with the scent of hay and whiskey. The general store's clerk, a wiry man with spectacles, weighed the watch, his lips pursed. $10, he said, not meeting Caleb's eyes. It wasn't enough, not nearly. But Caleb took the coins, their clink a hollow victory. He bought a sack of flour for Martha, a ribbon for Lila, a small knife for Ethan. The rest he kept, knowing it wouldn't satisfy the rider. Back at the cabin, he gave Lila the ribbon, her fingers brushing his as she took it. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, a crack in her armor. Ethan clutched the knife, his grin wide, and ran off to carve a stick. Caleb watched them, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. He thought of Jonah, the way he'd whittled under the stars, telling stories of rivers and mountains they'd never see. Caleb had believed him then, believed in a future. Now, he wasn't sure what he believed, but he wanted to give these kids something to hold on to. The rider returned on the 29th day, his horse kicking up dust that stung Caleb's eyes. Martha stood firm, her stick planted, but her face was pale. Lila and Ethan hid inside, their shadows small against the window. "Time's up," the rider said, his voice cold, his hand resting on a pistol at his hip. Caleb stepped forward, the coins in his pocket too few, his heart pounding. "I got 10, he said, holding out the money. The rider laughed, sharp and cruel. "Not enough, Drifter, they're mine." Caleb's hand twitched toward the colt, but Martha's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, her eyes on the rider. "There's another way." She spoke of a debt the town owed her, a favor from years back, enough to cover the rest. The rider's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing, but he nodded, taking the coins and a promise of the rest. He rode off, the dust settling slow, like a storm, passing. That night, Caleb sat with Lila and Ethan outside the cabin, the stars bright above. Lila tied the ribbon in her hair, her fingers steady now. Ethan leaned against Caleb, his knife tucked away, his breathing soft. The desert was quiet, the wind a gentle hum, carrying the scent of sage. Caleb looked at the cracked earth beneath, his boots, the same earth that had taken Jonah, and felt something shift in, a peace, but a kind of acceptance. He'd found a place, not free of hurt, but worth fighting for.